Hello and welcome to Items On, the podcast where you get to follow your favorite Melee players and personalities both on and off the sticks. I'm your host, Ethiopium, and today's guest is none other than the one, the only, Armada. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, usually how we start off these interviews is we get into what were you doing before you found Melee and how did you find Melee?
So before Melee, my first Melee tournament was when I was almost 12, so I was very young, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was in second grade, third grade, somewhere around there, and I played video games my whole life. I have an older brother, Aeolus. A lot of old school Melee players probably recognize his tag. He was my teammate for many years before Android. So my dad got him an NES way back, right? So I was born with like Nintendo games playing ever since I physically could hold a controller, right? So yeah, literally born with a controller in my hands. So yeah, we played a bunch of variety Nintendo games for many years prior to Melee, right? I do remember probably around 2000 or something like that. A friend of Aeolus had Smash Brothers to N64, right? So I remember we got to borrow it, and me, Aeolus, and Android, we were all hooked from the start, right? So it instantly became the game we always played. Eventually, we returned it. We bought our own copy, and then when Melee came out, it was like we need to buy this game.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember Aeolus, he found like tournament VODs from like Ken, Bomb Soldier, a lot of the old school players, right? So I remember we were watching that, and yeah, we got into the community pretty early.
Now, were you finding these through Smashboards? Like, how were you able to find the community early on before things like Facebook or Discord were really, the main options for finding tournaments?
So Aeolus was the one that found it initially, and I think like he went to I think it was like the same school or something along those lines with Helios, also a very old school Swedish player. Maybe they didn't go to the same high school, but they knew each other one way or another. Because Helios, who was the first TO in the Swedish Smash community, he also went to these old school Nintendo Swedish Championship events that Nintendo of Sweden organized every year. And it was kind of like a community forming around those events. And I remember Helios was one of the players at those events, right? And me and Aeolus and Android, we also went to those events. So maybe their paths crossed through that. But at least one way or another, and Aeolus got to hear about the very first tournament in Sweden through Helios, since he was the one hosting it, right? And that was early '05. So it was probably on that path that he got to hear about competitive Smash and then like showed me and introduced me as well, right? Uh, yeah, both me and Aeolus, we did go to Ross 1, Renaissance of Smash, in February 2005. And that was the first tournament ever hosted in Sweden. And then Android followed suit not too long after.
Were you always like a competitive person? Because like entering tournaments at like such a young age, like playing against your brothers, that type of stuff, I feel like it allows you to be competitive in this video game. Is that something that you feel like you've had throughout your life, that competitive surge?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, partially through video games, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're three brothers. Sometimes other siblings joined in when we played video games, but it was primarily the three of us, right? So I mean, we always try to best one another, like beating each other in the various games we played, Smash mainly, but also other games, of course. But even like in school and stuff, I remember between classes when you're like in first, second grade, and so on. I think in English you call it marbles. Like the
Yeah, the
smaller
little small,
ones.
yeah.
Yeah, we had various games playing with that. And I remember when I was a kid, one of my friends, he gave me like 5 or 10, right? And then after a few days in school, I had racked up so many of them. And my dad was like, where did these come from? Because, I haven't bought them. Like, who did you get these from?
Yeah.
Right? And I was like, winning, against all the kids and he's racking them up. So I mean, I guess like the competitive urge was like kind of in school too. Like the marbles, we played a lot of like street hockey,
Mm-hmm.
uh, So yeah, I mean, not only video games, but the competitive aspect period was something I enjoyed. But of course, mainly applying to video games, but also in other areas.
So you were talking about earlier how you went to Renaissance, which was, I believe, what you said, the first Swedish tournament, at least in 2005, I believe. I mean, what was the scene like in Sweden when you guys were building the cornerstone, building the foundation for the scene? Because I'm sure it looks a lot different than what it is today, for example.
Yeah, like that first tournament, like a lot of the people there I remember was from the same Nintendo tournaments I talked about earlier. So, like, I think we were maybe like 90-ish people at that tournament, which is pretty large for being like the first tournament, right?
Yeah,
But
definitely.
yeah, a lot of the. Hmm?
I said definitely. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, a lot of the people from these like Nintendo events showed up, but also like I know like afterwards, I didn't know it at the time, but it was some international players there. Like the Melee community in their country started earlier, right? I'm
Hmm.
pretty sure in the Netherlands, their competitive scene started in 2002 already, I believe. And here we need to remember that Melee was released about half year later in Europe, right? So it was in May, unlike Japan and North America when it came out late 2001, right? But I think the Netherlands already had a competitive community by the end of 2002, maybe early 2003. And it was also other players from like France, Norway, and stuff that had been to some type of tournament before. So, I mean, out of these 90 people, maybe like 80 people, that was their first tournament ever, right?
Hmm.
So, yeah, it was a new experience for almost everyone. After that tournament, I think we were roughly about 30 people. That was kind of like coming back to like the tournaments we had maybe every 2.5, 3 months or something like that. Also, somewhat close to Gothenburg. And I don't know, like everyone was pretty new to it, right? And I think back then when the community was so small, everyone knew each other, right? So it was kind of cool. But also as a kid being that young, most people were quite a bit older, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, you kind of grew up in the community. I mean, especially for me and Android, since we were both so young. My third tournament was his first tournament. So that was probably like summer-ish 2005. And yeah, I mean, he was only 10. So we were for sure the two youngest kids
what
in
was
these parts. Yeah.
what was it like competing at that young age? I mean, you're going up against guys that might be twice your age, who like what was it? Was it intimidating competing at that age? Were you comfortable with it?
I think if anything, like it maybe not early on because I was not like the prodigy early on or anything like that. I was kind of average, right?
Hmm.
So like I was kind of in the middle of the pack. But I think as I got better, it was probably more intimidating for other people, right? That someone
Hmm.
that is like 12, 13 kicking your ass, right? So for me, I don't really think I thought about it like that when I was younger, right? It's like this is my favorite game. I love playing it. I like testing myself. Truth be told, when I went to my first tournament, this is similar to like most people have gone to a tournament without having too much knowledge beforehand. I went to my first tournament thinking I was gonna be like, if not winning the tournament, at least top five or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Because I was good. I was beating my friends and all of that classic stuff. But that obviously wasn't the case. I didn't make it out of pools. And I remember watching the grand finals. It was Ek and Helios, so two Swedes in the final. Uh, and the crowd was very into it. People were excited, and I remember thinking like, I want to sit in that chair. I want to be the best in the world. Like kind of like naive maybe as a kid, but like that's what I felt at the time. So I don't know. Like I don't really think I thought too much about the age thing early on, but as I got better and then starting beating people while still being that much younger, at times I think some people may not have been like the biggest fan of losing to someone that much younger. I mean, I think at the end of the day, most people probably have some type of competitive pride, and maybe when the age difference is too large, that can be hard for some people's ego to handle.
Hmm.
I don't know, but for me, I didn't think about it too much as a young kid.
It's interesting what you said right there, where you're watching grand finals and you said, that got to be me one day. I want to be the best. I want to go up there. I want to play those big games. I want to win those trophies. Was that like a commitment? Did that switch anything in 12-year-old Armada's trajectory? Where did you start like practicing more? Did you start going to smash boards more to try to get info? What did the come up look like, I guess? Because like you said I got dropped out of pools basically. So going from that to fighting, I think Renaissance 4 versus Amsa, going toe to toe with
Yeah,
one of
that's
the
correct.
best in the world at that time. Like, how did you get up there? I guess.
I mean, I think it was an eye opener. Like you realized that it was so many other people that probably had similar experiences to you, playing with their friends, maybe siblings, maybe being good in that like 5 to 10 group of people, right? Maybe even less than that. So I think it was more of like an eye opener that there are people that are at least as good, and many of them are a lot better. So I mean, I think the three of us, because Android, he wasn't actually allowed to go to the first two tournaments because he was only 10, right? I'm kind
Hmm.
of surprised our parents let me go in the first place. But the third tournament, when they realized, all right, it's fine, and Aeolus, you take care of the two younger ones, right?
Hmm.
So, but I mean, I think at that point, like, we're all like motivated to just improve and get better. We already played Melee, like, essentially every day, even before going to tournaments, like after school and stuff. So I mean, now it was more like a purpose, right? Now we're playing, we want to improve, we want to do well at these tournaments. And then early on as well for me and Eniolis, we wanted to get better at teams, right? We were hooked on teams from the start as well. Like
Hmm.
all three of us, that was our favorite format. Uh, but yeah, I mean, afterwards, like Smashboards was not really a thing I did go to. The language barrier. Uh, Maybe not as much these days, but back then, especially as a kid, I struggled so badly when it came to English. It was my worst subject in school by far.
Really?
I think traveling for Smash is what eventually put me on the right path because I was way worse than like all my classmates. And not really for a lack of trying, it was just not one of those things that I picked up on easier.
Did you have like any other competitive hobbies during this time, or did you just solely commit to Melee at this point? Because, 12 or 13-year-old me, I would say, oh, I want to be the best soccer player, or I want to be this and that. And then 3 weeks later, I'm on to the new hobby. I'm surprised that you were able to find that commitment to the game so early and keep it throughout your career. So were you tempted by other games, other sports, for example, or art?
Um, I've always liked sports a lot. I've always watched a lot of sports. I actually went to a game of football today, like regular football.
Yeah.
Uh, go with a lot of my siblings and my grandpa. Like we all have season passes. So I mean, I've always enjoyed sports and I liked playing it in school. I did go to table tennis sessions for a little bit of time. Uh, but I mean, part of the issue was like, okay, first of all, video games was always like my number one passion. So, uh, I mean, I found my calling very early. But also when it came to like sports and stuff, like my family at the time, we lived a little bit further away from the school, not super far, but like enough of a distance where a drive 100% was needed, right?
Hmm.
And I have 10 siblings, and my dad
Whoa.
was the only one with a driver license. My mom does not have a driver license. So basically, when it came to a lot of sports and activities like that, it was very hard to make it work. Uh, so I don't know. I mean, for me, I don't think it mattered that much. It would have been fun to play like a little bit here and there because I enjoyed it, but I probably never felt like, oh, I want to be like the best table tennis player. But I enjoy playing. Even today, like if a table tennis table is up there, I'll play, But I never had the urge to like compete in that sense. But it was fun like as a side thing, various sports. But with video games, it was like from the get go, I wanted to compete.
I mean, when you were doing this come up, did you have a moment in your youth where you're like, because you said I want to be the best in the world, I want to be playing those games. Did you have a moment where you said, "Oh, I can actually do it," or was it instant belief that, "Oh, I'm gonna do this"?
No, I think I mean it was like it is somewhat like one moment, but like also a somewhat short time period at the same time. So I went to my first tournament as a Peach main, right?
Hmm.
Uh, throughout one of these competitive Nintendo events, it was a person that played Peach. TLDR is basically he played Peach, and I didn't know what crouch cancel was at the time, right? And down smash just gave like 60-70%. And I was like, that's my move. That's my character. Love it. Right? And I main Peach for a while, but then I got inspired by the player that was the best in Europe back in the day, and he was a Marth main. So I picked up Marth for a while, and I mean I improved, but not at like a crazy pace or anything like that. It was like slow and steady improvement, maybe a little bit faster than average, but like not really faster like by a significant amount. So I
Mm-hmm.
was slowly climbing the ranks, but it was still like far behind the best players. But then I remember in 2007, uh, so about yeah, shortly like slightly less than 2 years from my first tournament, me and Eniolis we went to Stockholm for a tournament, and the way my bracket worked out was basically more favorable for Peach. I played against another guy. He was my age as well, and Eniolis beat him in pools with Peach. So Eniolis told me that you should play Peach against this guy. My Peach beat him. Yours is better because even if I was a Marth main, I played Peach in teams
Mm-hmm.
since '05 because since Eniolis already was a Marth main, we figured double Marth was a bad idea. So we kept playing his Marth, my Peach. Uh, but yeah, at that tournament, I played Peach a lot, and it felt like I was already doing better against a lot of these players than my Marth would. So I was like, you know what? I think I'm gonna, play a little bit more Peach, right? Around the time, I was probably top 10-ish Sweden, maybe ninth or eighth, but like the lower end of top 10, right? Then about 2 months later, I got fifth place for the second time. So that was like my first tournament being like full peach main now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And within 6 weeks, I went from basically getting 3-0'd by people that I never really taken close before to like 3-0ing numerous of these players and even making it to grand finals at one of the tournaments. So in the span of 6 weeks, it felt like I went from a top 10 player in Sweden to a potential threat in Europe. And
Mm-hmm.
then we had Ross 4 coming up 2 months later. And that was like my first true test, right? And I remember going into that tournament, like I've always had like almost unreal uh, faith in myself, my capabilities of winning. But that was like probably one of the few times, beside like after like the early days and whatnot, where I was like, Amsa, he's too good. He's gonna win the tournament. He's just like he's that guy. But anything besides that is like I gotta try, right? And I end up playing as Amsa in losers, and I beat him game one, and I beat him game three. So I'm up 1-0 and 2-1, and I'm up in game five as well, and I lose in the end by literally one hit.
Mm-hmm.
That was a set I clearly could have won, and that made me realize that not only that I can be the best, because Amsa, I truly believe back in '07, '08, Amsa may have been like, maybe not the best in the world, but at the very least close to it. We can
Mm-hmm.
never tell, right? Because
Yeah.
Europe and the US didn't really compete at the time. And you also had like a couple players from Japan that was still like good at the time too. But even if Amsa wasn't the best, he was like up there. Uh, and I was that close to beating him. So I was like, if I can be that close after playing Peach as my main character now for this short, I think I can do it. And then after that tournament, I never went into a set again believing I can't win. So that tournament, I was like, I can do it.
Were there certain things about Peach that allowed you to play in the style that you wanted? Because, like you said, I mean, having going from like around top 10 in Sweden to now going toe to toe with some of the best in the world in a span of 6 to 8 weeks is like incredible, right? So was there some?
Yeah, like Ross was a little bit after the
Okay, apologies.
6 to 8 weeks was maybe like 3 months before that, but it's still like a relatively short
Yeah.
gap. Uh, but I mean, I think it's more like some characters kind of naturally suit certain people better. Like, how do you look at the game? How do you want to play the game? Some characters have more traits that is similar to what you are good at. And I think with Peach, that was just more like traits to the character that suit me. I think I could become good with Marth, but I don't think the way the character is built that it suited me as well, right? Like for Smash, for example, I think uh like one early example is like I was very good out of shield. Marth
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really have too much in that area. Peach has at least a little bit. Not as much these days as, like when people's pressure and stuff got better over the years. some out of shield options obviously became weaker when people's pressure got better. But another one was also like a projectile. That's something you can see in a lot of my Smash characters, like Pit and PM, for example, as well. You don't have that with Marth, right? Uh, so I mean, there are sometimes like some key details that can be big. I think that some characters just click better for some people. So I think that happened with Peach, and it also always made me wonder that maybe some people just haven't found their true character, if that makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think really good players can make a bunch of characters work. You can see someone like Plop, for example. Like he can play any character in the game. Like he still is more suited with some characters, and he do better with some. But yeah, like good players can often make many work. But I still believe that some character and some play styles and the way you can play them, it just suits some people better.
Makes
If that makes
sense.
sense.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. That's a great answer. I want to move forward now in your career to Genesis. I think that's where, the casual Melee fan probably heard of you first coming onto the scene. You were talking about how, there was that language barrier. There's, I'm sure, a huge cultural barrier. I mean, apart from just flying out there and the length of the journey, which must be brutal, like, what were some of the challenges once you got into the venue? I mean, was it hard to communicate? Was it a culture shock? And how were you able to overcome these to play fantastic Melee?
Yeah, I mean, when it came to the language, it was a huge barrier. Honestly, Eniolas translated most of the things for me. It was a very basic communication for me. Beyond that, I mean, it was a little bit if people like talked slowly and very basic, I could understand, and like if people gave me time, I could somewhat make myself understood. But it's also like sometimes the pressure, right? A lot of people that talk more than one language can probably relate to the fact that when they're new to it, it almost feels embarrassing because you're bad at it. But most of the time, it's not even the people that speak the language that say or do anything bad about it. It's more insecurity from the person doing it because you want to make yourself understood and all of that, right? So I mean that could be awkward at times, but honestly, it was a lot of grinding. A lot of grinding. I was there trying to do my best, right? And I remember going into Genesis One, it was a lot of like trash talk and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it, like people just do for fun, but some of it was probably like what people genuinely believed because it was hard to say like how good was I at the game compared to the best Americans, right? We had never really seen a true test of like the best in Europe against the best in North America, right? So no one truly knew how big or small the difference was. But in the US at the time, the general consensus was like if you are from Europe, you can't compete in the US. And the fact that Peach wins in Europe, that is proof that Europe sucks.
Mm,
That was the line of like talking a lot of people did. Uh, so I almost felt like it was like I have to like play for Europe at the same time. If I do bad here, we have no excuse, right?
yeah.
Uh, so yeah, I do remember that was like a lot of pressure. In terms of culture shock, it was probably more like playing more with like intense crowd. I remember when I played against AMSA, the crowd was intense in my favor, since we were playing in Sweden, right?
Mm,
But I never really played with a crowd like that much and like against me. I don't really like to say against me because I don't think anyone had like anything against me, but it's more like in traditional sports too, right? People tend to root for the home country, the home team. So whether I played against like Lucky or Chiss or Mango or Mutaking, like people rooted for the US. It makes sense.
mm-hmm.
So it wasn't like weird as a concept, but it was something I had to like almost more trying to learn on the fly. Uh, so I mean that made it tougher, and I mean it makes it a disadvantage playing away from home essentially. But it was a cool experience at the same time. It was the biggest event at the time, period, I think.
Yep.
Uh, so yeah, no, it was a cool experience for sure.
What do you think were some of the lessons that you were able to learn from that you took further into your career? I mean, I'm sure composure might be one of them, like playing in front of a crowd like that.
Yeah, I think composure part of it. I think I also realized that for the most part I was pretty good at it. I always had the theory, growing up with so many siblings, it's probably not. the biggest surprise that it may be little bit more loud than most households.
Yeah.
So I always had the theory that maybe that was a helping factor. I know a good friend of mine, he always said that if we were sitting on like Skype or whatever, he was like, I don't understand how you can like think when it's so much noise around. But then he was also like, it makes sense. Like at tournaments that you're very good at like focusing, right? You
Hmm.
zone in on whatever is important, right? So ironically, I do think that probably helped in a sense. Uh, I think also overcoming a tough loss. I mean, losing to AMSA was a tough one, but the thing is, like when I lost to AMSA at Ross 4, like the day after, I could still be pretty proud of myself. Most people going into that tournament did not believe I was going to place top 4. Some Swedes maybe saw me as like a dark horse, like make top 8 or something. But outside of Sweden, I don't think anyone realistically thought I was going to make it that far. I don't even think I was in people's radar. Uh, so with Genesis 2, then it was more like I knew I was very good. I truly believed I could win Genesis 1 when I made it there.
Hmm.
And my proof that I really felt like I could do it when I was playing friendlies with the best players. I remember I played against Mango early on at Genesis 1. We only got to play 2 games and we traded. I played one game against King. I won that one. And I started to feel that more players I played that these players are obviously great, right? But it's not like we're talking about a huge gap here. It really felt to me that anything could happen. So that's probably partially why losing Genesis 1 was a tough one at first, because like looking back at it now, I can be proud of how well I did for, being so young in a country where I couldn't even really communicate with people, right? And I was 16. I was like literally a kid,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Uh, but it was still like tough to accept the loss when it was like one hit away. Ironically, like I actually missed like the A button for a most likely game-winning nair in Game 5 for a set of grands. So I felt like such an idiot that it's like the biggest button. Like, how do you miss? But
Yeah.
we're all humans, right? We're
Yeah.
all humans.
I think you could excuse 16-year-old Armada for that. I'd be missing every button when I play still, so I can't hate.
Yeah.
Do you? I mean, coming back then to Genesis 2, I mean, was that like such a triumph then? I mean, what was your thought after that tournament?
Yeah, I mean, for Genesis 2, so we had like quite a few super majors in between, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I got second at Apex 2010 to HBox and second at Pound 4 to PPMD, right? I also got fourth at Pound 4, which was my next tournament after Genesis 1. But Genesis 2, it kind of felt like full circle in a way, like coming back exactly to the same place, the same venue. I remember being very happy it was gonna be like the same venue because I always felt like I left that place without what I came for. So I remember seeing the thread at Smashboards at the time with the Genesis 2 belt, and I was like, that's mine. I'm not gonna leave this place without that belt.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I remember being very happy with Genesis 2 being back in that same location, getting a chance again because Mango at the time was essentially retired. I mean, he won Pound 4, but then after that he played like Mario and like he did go to some tournaments, but he played, yeah, Mario. He didn't play Spaceys. He didn't play Puff. Uh, so I remember I was very sick at Pound 4. So in my mind, it felt like I didn't really get a second chance.
Mm-hmm.
I got Genesis, and that was it. And I never got any chance whatsoever, right, to get a proper rematch. Uh, so I remember that was also a factor. He was going to play, so I was happy about that. And then the way the bracket worked out as well, especially looking back at it, I don't remember if I thought about it too much at the time, but I almost found it poetic that I played PPMD in winners quarters. He got upset in pools, so they put him in my path very early. Which actually felt very common back in the day that if someone got upsetted, they got put in my path to make it more interesting or whatever. Uh, then I played Hungrybox in winners semis, and I beat him as well. Then I played Tosh in winners finals. So that's like a little bit of like the throw off from the point I'm trying to make.
Mm-hmm.
And then I played Mango in grands, right? So you had the three people that stopped me from winning a super major, and I kind of beat them in reverse order. Like we were working our way backwards in the
Mm-hmm.
timeline. So that was a very, very satisfying win. Because yeah, all of them denied me first place, respectively. And I mean, they all deserved it, right? But it felt nice to beat them all and take my first place at a super major.
When you won, did you feel like the sense of relief? Did you feel the sense of, okay, I've done what I wanted to accomplish, or did it make you more hungry to continue winning? What was your
I think
thought
it was
process
a
there?
combination of everything, actually. I
Mm.
mean, at first, it was like the happiest moment of your life type of feeling. Uh, I mean, then afterwards, like, on the way back and stuff, in a way, it felt like a relief too, because looking back to that first tournament in 2005, when I was like, I wanted to be the best player in the world, winning Genesis 2, it kind of felt like, at least for one day, I'm the best in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we didn't really have like proper world rankings and stuff like that back then, so I don't really think people thought about it exactly like that. But to me, it felt like a relief. To me, it felt like at least today I can say I'm the best player in the world. That's how I felt at the time. But then afterwards, I was like, this is only the start.
Mm.
And I think for me, after quite a few very close calls, some people in a kind of disrespectful way. Some people did it, maybe trying to get on my nerves or whatever. The second place master. So I guess I tried to become the first place master after that. And I guess it worked out solid.
I agree that cabinet trophies are show that point. One thing that I really respect out of you and your career is the way that you overcome the odds, whether it be from, being in Europe and having to travel to, playing certain characters that people labeled as weak at that time. I mean, do you feel like, especially at that young age, you're still a teenager, do you feel like that helped your confidence in a way? Like being able to see yourself grow and become the best through Melee? Or do you feel like it added undue stress or undue stress, I guess, at that young age?
For the most part, I would say the age thing, I would say it's an advantage,
Mm-hmm.
actually. Like, I mean, if you look at like most professional sports or competitive anything, you often have the young people that started very early and properly. They are often the ones reaching higher up, right? I mean, it's not always the case, but it's often the case. Whether it's like, yeah, melee, professional sports. I don't think you're like doomed if you don't start early, but like, I do think it's a big advantage. I mean, take like a little kid trying, like, you have like a very young kid, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they pick up on a language just like that. I mean, I think it's like probably like similar with some muscle memory stuff where it's just like if you learn it early when you're young, you're more receptive to learning. I mean, kind of like the old saying, if like you can't learn an old dog new tricks. It's obviously exaggerated, but I 100% believe there's some truth to that. Uh, so I think in terms of the age thing, for the most part, that was a benefit for me. And I mean, honestly, if you look at like all of the gods or whatever, I guess they all started pretty young, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
I
so
guess
I do think overall it's an advantage.
I guess what I was asking is more like even in a more emotional context where I'm saying like being able to overcome these odds at a young age, you can look back on that now and have confidence through that. Do you feel proud? Do you feel like it is a place where you can put your hat on and say, no, you know what, I'm able to do these things further on in my life, whether it be take on speed running, for example, because I was able to learn these truths at a young age, or do you feel like it hampered your response? I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say absolutely playing competitive melee, and probably even more so when you got like so nice feedback in a way. I mean, it kind of showed me and taught me that I can do a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think absolutely that can be applied to anything in life, and probably also like just discipline, staying responsible about it, setting smaller goals, and working towards longer goals too. I think a lot of factors was taught through competitive gaming, and probably some factors that people on the outside may not understand at all. So yeah, no, I absolutely would say a lot of learning lessons that can be applied to anything in life. Truly.
I want to ask you on one of those actually before we move on in your career, which is discipline. You know, it's actually one of the things that I wrote down in my notes when I was when I was studying for this interview. Was I just feel like even through your play style, through your conduct, you're just so disciplined. And I was wondering, A, how do you train that discipline? And B, do you feel like there's a big difference that you had to learn between motivation and discipline?
I mean, I think discipline is probably part of who I am as a person prior
Mm,
and after. I think so. But I think I always looked at it in the way of like, especially traveling to the US, it was just so many more good players, right? I remember looking up players before Genesis 1, trying to like prepare for potential opponents. But there was so many, right? Europe, I think at the time, like 2009, 2010, around there, I think Europe probably on average was its closest to the US, probably in 2010 especially. Uh, but we were more divided, like, different countries and stuff. Uh, so for me, like going to the US and realizing how many good players there are, you have like various states that would be like competitive with all of Europe, pretty much, right? Uh, and these players that was like my biggest rivals, they had a lot better practice conditions. So I kind of felt like I had to be more disciplined. I had to practice more. And even if some people maybe would argue that's not true, that's at least how I felt. And that's what I kind of try to use as a way to like practice more, right? Like not every day was always fun, especially because I had to play a lot against computers. But I was like, if I want to win these tournaments, you gotta kind of need to like clock in, right?
mm-hmm.
Most days was fun to practice, but in a way, I guess I treated it like more serious maybe than most. But again, like I felt like I kind of had to because even later in my career, I remember going to like Smash summits and stuff. I almost felt like now I have to make up for the worst practice conditions when I'm not in the States. So I remember at like summits, always like sit down, play, practice, prepare for every matchup, all type of players. Um, I don't know. I kind of felt like a lot of the American players didn't relate to that.
Mm.
Uh, yeah, that was my perception. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I felt. So yeah, I guess the discipline came from that too. That I have reached the top. I want to stay at the top, and I'm convinced this is the price I have to pay for it.
Mm. Do you feel like paying that price meant that you were able to enjoy maybe some of the aspects of the community less? Like for example in Smash Summits, you're talking about how you had to get there, you're grinding, you're looking at matchups, you're looking at getting that practice. And then I talked to other players who've done Smash Summits like, "Oh, it was so fun. I got to hang out with everybody and this and that." So was paying that price also, not only a discipline factor but also like in an emotional context, did you lose out on something there, you think?
Yeah, I would say so, both at tournaments and before tournaments.
Mm.
Like at tournaments, I was like, even if like friends or a girlfriend, I'm like, I'm doing my thing, like that's it. So like there's no point in bothering me. I will be 100% focused on what I need to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, do whatever at the tournament as you want, right? But I have to do my thing. So, in terms of like leaving tournaments, I almost felt like you didn't really hang out with pretty much anyone, right? You were just preparing for the final tests or like, the players, right? But even before tournaments, like, I like Android, Leffen, like a lot of the Europeans, sometimes we traveled very long beforehand to tournaments. Like before Evo, often staying for like a month prior. For Genesis, also like 3 weeks, maybe four at times. I remember one time, it was me, Android, Aeolus, my girlfriend, and
Mm-hmm.
then a friend of ours. We were gonna have a road trip after Genesis 4, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was there a long time before, and I was like, I'm gonna play all day, every day. Like you guys do as you please. I'll be glued to like this TV. food breaks, that's it pretty much, right?
Yeah.
And I remember they actually one of the days they wanted to go to Alcatraz, and I wanted to go there. I still want to go there. I've never been. And they
Yeah.
were like, "We're gonna go. Do you want to tag along?" And I was like, "I'm not gonna forgive myself if I lose the tournament because I wasted time." So they went. They had a good time. When they came back, I was still at the same TV, and I mean, I won the three-peat in singles, and me and Andrew won teams. So I was like, I can enjoy the road trip now. So I mean, that's kind of how my brain worked. But I think it was also in a way like some people would argue like a couple hours extra of practice maybe doesn't make that much of a difference, which is a fair point. But I think one part of it was also like if I feel that I've done everything I can, then that itself is a confidence boost.
Mm.
Like for Evo 2015, I remember I was in the States active for 4 weeks. It was tournaments, 4 weekends in a row. CEO, FC, What the Fox, and Evo 2015. And that entire summer, I think bare minimum clocking in 9 hours every day. Even when the days we
Wow.
had flights, 9 hours. Most days was probably more like 11. And then on top of that, like analyzing players, even like between the weekends, since it was like numerous tournaments, right?
Hmm.
So picking up on like new player habits and whatnot. So the discipline was there, I think is fair to say.
That's incredible, honestly. That it's eh, before Slippy doing that too. It's like so crazy because I could see people like, oh, I could play on ranked for a little bit here, and next thing you know, but like focused individual practice or like looking at a certain player, like, no, I need to check this out. Yeah, discipline is the best word for it for sure. I want to move
Yeah, I
on.
mean,
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
sometimes it could be a hassle too, because like at times, Andrew was there or Leffen was there or other Europeans, but at times it was kind of like you need to try to get people in the area to come over to
Mm-hmm.
wherever you are housed, or if you could like somehow make it to their place, right? So sometimes that could also be such a hassle because, as you talked about with Slippy and stuff, like that wasn't the perk back then, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it could often be like, oh, you text like maybe 10 players in this region and like kind of try to schedule like, oh, this player comes over this day and then try to play as much as possible. Then this player this day, sometimes two players on the same day, but they cover like the morning shift, the night shift. A little bit exaggerated, but you get the point, right?
Yeah.
So it was a lot of like organizing that as well. It was wild summers in its own way.
I mean, looking back on it, are you like, is that a positive memory? Is that something where you're like, oh, I'm so glad I did that, or is it something where you're like, oh, I wish I like enjoyed it a little bit more? Because those are the summers of your youth, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, I mean, it was very fun overall. I do think probably if I lived in the US, I probably could have like a little bit more healthy balance or whatever you want to say. But I truly believe that that was the price I had to pay to perform the way I did. So I don't regret it at all. I think looking back at it, if I treated it less serious and possibly or most likely had worse results, then that may have been a regret. But I can't say I regret it at all. Looking back, I felt like that's what it took to get the results I got, and I'm happy I did.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. I want to move on for the interest of time to around 2013. This is where I believe you're considering taking a good break. I think after Evo, you did take a break if I'm remembering correctly, or
It
was
was
it
actually
before
after
Evo?
Apex 2013 up to
Okay,
Evo 2013, and then back to it was like an intended retirement after
really?
Apex 2015. Yeah, no, it was an intended retirement. Uh, the main reason was like I got very fed up with playing in Europe. Not only really against like the best players, but like pretty much all the best players in Europe were non-Swedes for the most part. Leffen was like coming up around that time. Uh, like in 2013, 2012. Yeah, more like 2012 and stuff, but we didn't really get to play much whatsoever. Most of my practice in 2012 was probably I'm not even kidding when I say I think looking back at it, 90% of my playtime was probably against computers during that year.
Wow.
Android wasn't very motivated as Melee at the time, and I mean that was before we teamed too, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was obviously a huge motivator for him in like later years, the whole team aspect, right? Um, and a friend of mine, Mike Hagar, he played with me once in a while. I still lived at home with my parents, so it
Mm-hmm.
was kind of like maybe like an hour and a half one way with like public transport. But we played like maybe once a month. But he only played with me, and even said it. He played with me because he wanted me to remain the best. So as his friend, he was like, "I want to help you," but he wasn't playing for his sake. So it was more like, "You can use me as a punching bag because I know it's helpful for you." So that was very kind of him, obviously. But that was pretty much how limited my practice was. A little bit with Android, a tiny bit with Hagar, and then playing his computers. And yeah, it got very. It was annoying, and I mean, also it was like kind of stressful back then too, because like I was always the one that had to make the trip, and it was like, very expensive. Basically, if I got second at a super major, I probably lost money. Best case scenario, broke even.
Mm.
So I knew every time I went to the States, you better place bare minimum top two, or you can't go to the next one.
That's crazy.
So
That is a crazy amount of pressure, and I don't
yeah.
blame you for trying to step away. What made you want to come back then?
So I think like at the time, like I stopped playing, right? And I don't think anyone truly could realize how big of an impact Evo 2013 and primarily the Smash documentary would have.
Mm.
Like even in Sweden, like the community blew up, right? Everywhere the community blew up. Not only in the States, all over Europe. I went to Australia in 2014 and like probably 80 to 90% of the players in Australia when I was there started due to the Smash documentary or maybe Evo. So it was more tournaments, more players that wanted to play. The community was in a good spot. So I think that's primarily what like sparked my interest to play again because now it was more players to play against. It wasn't only playing against computers. I still played against computers a solid chunk, um, but I actually did get to play more against humans. So I think that was a factor. Like when people like when I retired the second time, I think a lot of people were like, "Oh, it's gonna be back very soon." But it was very different because in 2018 it was more like I felt done, but in 2013 it was almost like I feel bored with what it takes
Mm.
because I just don't have any of the resources. And again, I think like overall, it probably was and maybe still is hard for some of the players to relate to some of this. I know some are like, maybe Amsa or Triff, Leffen, of course. I mean, some of the non-US players, maybe some people in Canada too, can probably more easily relate to it. But I would say it is a big difference. And yeah, my perception was always that it was not understood to the degree that I probably wanted.
Yeah, I mean, did you feel a little bit disrespected? Where it's
No,
like,
I wouldn't say disrespect. I think it was just more like a uh, lack of understanding. I mean,
mm,
for a lot of the people that watch on stream, they may only tune in for streams, right? They
mm,
don't see all the like behind the scenes, all the work and effort that takes for the player to sit on that stage, right? But even for like some of the good players, like if you have maybe a 30-minute drive, you have numerous top 20 players in the world. Or and sometimes even you had like numerous like top 10 players living like not that far from each other. I mean, at times it felt like I wish I had that.
mm-hmm.
But I mean, again, I knew if that's the case, then I need to move to the US, but then it's other things you need to sacrifice, right? And that was the price I was never willing to pay.
Mm. Was that a thought that actually ran through your head, like legitimately trying to, especially after I think 2014 when you got signed by Alliance and stuff, and it was starting to be more of an esport? Was that a thought that you had in your mind to move to the States?
Nah, it was never a thought. I mean, I think part of it is also like I could always compete at the top, So maybe if I really felt like it was actually impossible, maybe I would have been thinking about it differently. But I never thought it was actually impossible. I felt more that I just have to do more uh, to get the same type of results. That's how I felt, right? But no, I never considered actually moving. I mean, as I said earlier, I have 10 siblings. I mean, of course, some of them I see more often, but overall, as a group, I would say all 11 of us are very close. I have my girlfriend here,
Mm-hmm.
her family as well, my parents, my grandparents, like all of it is like in Gothenburg or very close to Gothenburg. So I didn't want to like because if I moved to the States, I would not be in Sweden often whatsoever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I felt like that, like yeah, friends and family, like that mattered more. I didn't want to like essentially move away from all of that just for Melee, if I can say that, considering how big a part of my life it was. But that's how I felt.
It's incredible to hear someone who has obvious like passion and work ethic for something still be able to place that in like a healthy place, I guess, for example. Like, not because a lot of people get lost in the sauce almost, where it's like, forget the family, forget the friends, I'm trying to follow this dream. So I respect that. And I mean, you were right. You were able to dominate. I mean, 2015. I want to talk about 2015 because that's one, in my personal opinion, one of the most dominant years out of anything I've ever seen, sports or esports, whatever. Some stats, winning on every single player. You were 11-0 against players that weren't gods, that were in the top 10. Just an insane stat to hear. Was there anything specific about that year that allowed you to be that dominant player?
I think it was two main factors. Some people may say no Johns to the first one, uh, but in my perspective, I was the best player when I walked away in 2013, right?
Mm-hmm.
I won Genesis 2, Apex 2010, Smashers Reunion when PP&D came over to Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and then Apex 2013. All of them back to back, right? Uh, and then I played close to no Melee over the next year, with the exception of like the 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks leading up to Evo 2013. We can go in more to that later if you want to, but overall, that full year, I barely played any Melee at all. And I mean, of course, if you haven't played Melee much whatsoever, it takes time to de-rust, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some people have this weird idea that if you pick up the controller, you're going to be at least as good as you were, even if you haven't played. And at least in my experience, that is the furthest thing from the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very rusty. It took time to like just regain the skill I used to have. And by the time I did that, then I needed to like actually like improve, right? I feel like overall in 2014 I did a solid job. I still climbed back to like number two that year, but I never felt like I was truly back yet, right? So in 2015, when I had roughly like a year to come back, I felt more that all right, I feel more ready now. Uh, so I think that was a big factor. Uh, and then I think also like just the happy place in life. I got together with my girlfriend in 2015 as well.
Nice.
Uh, I absolutely think outside factors, how you're doing outside of the game impacts how you do in game. 2014 was actually like a very shitty year, like on that topic for non-Smash reasons as well. So that is something I think every player can relate to. If your life is very well in order, you feel very happy, it gets easier to not only do the hours, but also like perform, right? So I think that's, yeah, absolutely another factor to it as well.
Well, there's one other piece that I want to touch on, which is doubles. I feel like you're one of the greatest doubles players. I can see how much it means to you already. You're smiling, talking about doubles. Do you enjoy doubles more than singles? Is it more fun for you?
I always did. I
Yeah.
always did. Ever since me and Aniola's team, that first time, that was the first time we ever tested teams. And it was our favorite format. And then quickly became Android's favorite format when he got to play it. All three of us, we're all uh, teams.
What makes
Yeah.
what makes you like it a lot more than singles? What certain aspects?
I think it's like a lot of the things when it comes to like how you play feels almost more free flow than singles. I mean, of course, melee compared to most fighting games have a very like dynamic and like interesting punish game. But I think in teams, it's even more like when you're working as a unit, right? I think the punish game gets more interesting. I think edge guards often gets more interesting. Team saves is a very cool aspect that don't exist in singles. Uh, yeah, I think like the whole aspect is just like it's more fun. It's also less campy, which I feel like something a lot of people complain about in singles that oh
Yeah.
this player plays so lame or so campy. That almost never happens in teams. So why do more people like teams? You don't camp, you play, you fight. I
What
don't know. I think a lot of it is, and also I think like sharing it with some like, especially if you team with someone like you, like as a sibling or a best friend. I think that also is cool to share that victory with someone else.
I mean, I totally believe it because one of the things I wanted to bring up was Big House 5, I believe, where you were playing with your brother, you won, and a huge pop off. I mean, just a roar like a lion, you know? Like you could obviously see that passion that you've had. Do you feel like that's uh it's a bigger passion because you were teaming with your blood brother, or do you feel like it was just the moment of the game?
No, I mean, I think also like a little bit combination of all of it.
Mm,
So with Big House 5 in particular, me and Android are, I mean, technically we did team at Evo 2013, but Apex 2015 was like the first time we teamed in the States as an actual like team. Uh, and we almost won that tournament, right? It was game 15 against Mutaking and Hungerbox, who had never lost a tournament at that time. I
yeah.
don't remember how many tournaments they had won at that point, but a solid chunk, right? And yeah, like okay, I think like not the statute of limitations, but like at the time of Apex 2015, I was told if me and Android, if we win Apex 2015, they will sign Android. So I played
Mm,
my heart out at Apex 2015 when I make that 1v2 comeback against Ice and Leffen for us to win like 3-1. Also like one of probably my more iconic pop-offs.
yeah.
But then we lose game 15 in honestly a very unlucky way. I remember Andrew was like gonna save me. Like we all have one stock left. Me, Android, HBox, and Mute King. And I'm doing an up B with Fox. And Mute King is gonna, come out trying to get me, but Android is ready and hits him and he's gonna die, but he flies into Fox's fire and kind of gets stuck in the air. And instead of us getting a 2v1, I end up dying, and then
Hmm.
he has a 2v1. So we lose in like such a heartbreaking way. And I mean, there was other factors too. I think they honestly probably would have signed Android regardless, but other factors happened outside of like their control at the time, which was very unfortunate. But in that moment, it felt like we didn't only lose the tournament, but also a potential sponsorship, right?
Mm,
So I think that going into Big House 5, we lost so much, and it felt like me and Andrew, we really felt like we should have won. It's not really like Mutant King and HBox, if they win 8 out of 15 games, they deserve to win, but sometimes when it's that close as a competitor, it's easy to feel that you could have done it. It was such small margins, right? It
hmm.
can be harder to accept when it's that close rather than if it's a blowout, right? So I remember for Big House 5, me and Andrew was ultra focused on like we are not going to let this one slip away. We practiced so much teams, especially against like Puff teams or even like people in Gothenburg that didn't play Puff. It's like, can you please try playing Puff? And we really tried to get all these like ping pong combos like as consistent as possible. It was like HBox, I may not be able to combo you in singles much, but in teams, it's gonna hurt. It's
Yeah.
gonna hurt, right? So like we really, really try to optimize those in particular because Puff actually can die very early in teams from Fox's up air, and Sheik is so good at setting it up. Uh so yeah, no, we were super motivated to win that one. I think I had an interview with I think it was PPMD actually. We played like Cruise or something. I only have a vague memory, and I think I performed pretty good or something. And he was like that I wasn't like I don't remember exactly what it said, but something along the lines that I didn't seem too happy or like pop off related. And I think I said like wait for teams. And then that pop off happened. It's like, hope it was worth the wait, dude. I hope it was worth the wait.
That's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing that. I did not know any of those circumstances behind it. I have one more question about teams. What do you feel like is needed in order to bring teams back to that heyday? I mean, back in the day we had obviously the esports era helped with having like, CLG and SFAT PPU and your team for example. I mean, what is something that we can do in our scene today to help teams get back to what it was? And
I think the peak of doubles in terms of like interest for it was when the double circuit happened, which was 2017.
mhm.
So they had like a lot of tournaments that was part of the double circuit, and basically you collected points as a team, right? I think one of the core issues of why people don't follow teams as much, and I know there are more to it, but I think one factor is when people swap around teammates a lot. So it's like, oh, like, should I root for this top player in singles that this weekend team with this player and then the next weekend with this one? So that double circuit encouraged people to play with the same player, and then you had like a circuit finals, right? So you had me and Android, you had PewFat, you had Left and Ice. I'm pretty sure Mewking and HBox team that year for the circuit. Plop and Axe. I think you had Shroomed and STJ. You had a lot of like static teams that were really, really good. And I think it makes it more interesting when it's like a storyline between two teams. So I mean, if you take like me and Android against CLG or like PFAT, then you had like literally two brothers and two like best friends. They all very obviously love teams, and you get a compelling story that is like this team against this team. I mean, I think like if I played with like Mutaking, for example, and no offense to him, like because I enjoy teaming with Mutaking and we are great friends. But when it was more like jumping back and forth, then I think the compelling storylines is probably harder to build.
Mhm.
Like narratives, like it or not, becomes important. And I think like yeah, a circuit like that could help. But then of course you need to have some type of like incentive for people to actually commit to it, right? And maybe it was easier then. Maybe people like maybe it was just a time period where more people liked playing it more. I'm not sure, but I think it's at least one piece of the puzzle.
Makes sense. Yeah, and I hope that it comes back as stronger than ever. The more melee, the better. So, for the interest of time, I do want to touch. I mean, there's so many questions I could ask you about your storied career, but I do want to touch on your retirement. You said earlier on in the interview that it was different than the first time you retired because you really truly felt done. Can you describe more of that process of giving up a big piece of who you were and moving on to the next chapter in your life?
Yeah, so I mean like in 2013 it was more like as we talked about briefly like the more boring aspect of what it took to be at the top, especially back then with like no players around. In 2018 that wasn't like an issue. Like I mean of course compared to playing in the US, it wasn't as much, but I mean we still had a strong community. We still had good players. Gothenburg at the time for being Europe had like pretty solid a player base, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I could go to tournaments in Europe, the Netherlands, the UK. So that wasn't like as much of an issue. I think it was more like when I traveled the most during those years, so like 2014 to 2018, not as much 2018 since I stopped, but 2014 to 2017, a lot of those years I was out of country for about like 6 months a year, which some people may find hard to believe because sometimes it was like staying a longer time in the US. So even if like maybe some of those years I didn't have as many tournaments entered, to suggest such a high number, it was still like being away from home, right? And that kind of comes back to like the whole aspect of feeling like you need to make up for the lost time when you're not in the States. So when I was not only in the States, like just away from home, so like this applies to like trips in Europe or Australia or Canada or Mexico or whatever, wherever I went. Uh, I felt like after those years being gone that much,
Mm-hmm.
it started to take a toll on me. Uh, I didn't get to see my girlfriend as much as I wanted. I didn't get to see my family as much as I wanted. My friends. Uh, you notice a lot of things at home that you wanted to do, but you're not at home, right? It almost felt like at a point sometimes with friends where it's like there was no point in inviting me to anything because I probably won't be there.
Mm.
And I mean, that was just the realistic thing. And if someone didn't invite me, I couldn't even blame them because like I'm just not there. I don't have any specific instance or memory of that actually happening, but like if it did, I would not be able to blame them. And then also the thing is like after those 6 months, like some people may be like, oh, it's just like you're back home now, it's like back to normal. But after those long, intense trips and like the flights are all always very long, and believe it or not, I have like among the worst flight luck ever. Like almost every time I went to the States, my flights somehow ended up being delayed
Mm.
close to like every time. And I think that also started to take a toll on me eventually that all these trips are just like such a hassle to keep doing this. But yeah, I mean, I think overall it was the time away from home with all the like recharging and like how do you say like recharge the batteries after the trip. It almost felt like 7 months were kind of like fully focused on melee, and the other 5 was still like super, super, super focused. Like I obviously can't say for certain, but if you ask me my honest opinion, if I was from the States and I lived in like I don't know Florida, Cali, New York, you name it, if I were to guess, I probably would have kept playing a lot
Mm.
longer because then you don't need to be gone for as long, right? Uh, like the flights, obviously going to be way shorter on average. After a tournament is done, you're home much quicker, and it doesn't seem. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, and of course now with Slippy and stuff, of course not. But I never got the impression that any of the Americans like, oh, I'm gonna stay in like this state for like 3 weeks to prepare for Evo. It's like you can prepare in your own state, maybe fly in someday early, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that added up a lot, and it's also like a factor of like what it takes to sit on that stage that I think a lot of people may not have considered. And again, I don't want to sound like disrespectful or anything. I understand like for any player to make it up there, it's a massive sacrifice. It's tons of hours, passion that goes into it. Uh, nice, yeah. My experience was like I'm too much away from home, and if someone feel like that's not what they had, then that's their experience, right?
Yeah. Last big question about Melee. Then we'll do a little bit of a speed round because I have a couple questions, and then we'll get into what you're doing today. Um, I always ask this about, at least I try to ask this to everyone that I interview, which is, what do you feel like your perception of your legacy is, and are you happy with what your legacy is? Because it's been some time now off of the scene, um, and I'm interested to hear what do you, is it even important to you, your legacy?
I think everyone that have done something as long and as serious as I did Melee, I think you would lie if you said you don't care at all.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there is like a one in a million, exception to the rule among like professional gamers, athletes, whatever, right? Like I think it's gonna be exceptionally rare that people don't care at all. I care. I'm very happy. I'm very proud with what I did, but I don't want to go too much into detail about it. It was too much drama with some like melee stuff where I've raised various opinions in the past, some taken not only out of context but straight up lied about, and I'm kind of over like basically what I will give you is I'm happy and proud of what I did, but I don't want to go too much into detail because the internet can be a very toxic place. So I will let people have their own opinions,
I
and
totally
I
understand
think
and
that will,
respect that.
yeah,
Yeah, as long as you're proud of
everyone will
yourself,
be
that's what
happier that
matters.
way.
What was
Hmm?
that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think everyone will be happier that way. Everyone can have their own opinion. They can say that I did something good, bad, mediocre. Like have your own opinion. I'm happy with what I did. So I think that's what matters the most at the end of the day.
Exactly. Exactly. All right. Quick speed round here because there's so many questions that I can ask you about Melee, but I do want to touch on what you're doing today. So you can just answer these as quick as possible. Here we go. First one, favorite tournament that you've won.
For singles, Genesis 2. For teams, Genesis 4.
Favorite person to play against in friendlies.
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think in singles friendlies, I often had a very good time playing against Roomed. Me and Shroom
Shroomed.
were often like kind of, yeah, we were kind of like beefing and having a fun time. At times it didn't feel as serious. It was more like I just wanna I just wanna destroy you. I wanna wreck you. We also played like some teams a couple times in tournaments. I think we always just had a good vibe when we played singles friendlies.
Saltiest you've ever been, whether it be after a loss or maybe after a training. Was there something that ever made you super salty?
I think people would say they wouldn't believe me if I didn't say Apex 2010 Grands. So I guess it's probably the saltiest I ended up after losing a tournament.
Favorite city that you've been to because of Melee?
Damn, that's a tough one. It's been to a lot of places. Uh, I mean, probably California overall. So I don't know, either like LA or San Francisco, probably.
Which one's more fun to play as, Peach or Fox?
Peach,
If you had to play another character except Peach or Fox, who would you play?
Chic. I guess it goes in the family, you know.
Um, Favorite year of Melee that you've been a part of?
Mm, 2015.
Player that you respected as a competitor?
That's so many. But maybe
Give
I'll
us
say
some names.
Mute King then. I'll say Mute King then.
Player that when you saw in bracket, you're like, damn it, I have to play this person.
I guess sorry, H-Box. Hopefully you felt the same way.
And final one, I have to ask: are you ever interested in coming back and playing, or you think it's totally done? Because I've seen you commentate. We're always happy to hear you commentate.
I will be beyond surprised. But I mean, I said from the start, like, if I ever get the true urge to do it again, then I can, right? As long as my hands are not literally broken, the only thing stopping me is my own will, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's always been my stand on it. I don't think it will ever happen, but yeah, it's
Ooh.
just like I think for me, like I would have to be 100% wanting it, right?
Mm-hmm.
For me, like I always felt like when I play melee, it was like all or nothing. I didn't want to do it half-assed. Either I'm playing to be the best, or I don't want to play at all.
Mm.
Like some people are like, oh, but can you not play like 1, 2 tournaments a year? It's like, no. Either I want to play in a way where I feel like I'm giving myself an honest shot at being at the top, or I don't want to play at all. Because that wouldn't be fun to me. Like that's how I felt. And I understand that's not most people's experience,
Mm-hmm.
but that was my experience. So I would literally have to go back to being like all. And I think it's beyond unlikely.
Makes sense. Do you still play the game for fun? Do you just like play some friendly sometimes, or no?
Yeah, we actually have a melee monthly
Mm-hmm.
here in Gothenburg at a sport bar. A sport bar I actually go to sometimes to watch like football and hockey. But they host melee events there once a month. Ironically, this month is like the first one in forever where it's not happening because the guy running it, he's traveling right now. So me and Andrew, we normally go there and play teams. So hang out with friends, play some teams, grab some beers, have a good time.
That sounds awesome. That sounds like the way it should be. I'm happy for
Yeah.
you. My last quick question, I forgot to ask it. If you are still watching Melee, who are some newer players on the scene that you think are or at least have shown some talent, some pedigree in the eyes of Armada?
Um, I would say, I mean, okay, of course it depends on what we mean by newer, but if we mean someone that like kind of had their rise in more recent years, I've
Mm-hmm.
always enjoyed watching J-Mook a lot. I think he's very fun to watch. He's really good at the game, and I think and hope he's gonna bounce back soon. Don't get me wrong, he's still very good, obviously, but his year this time around hasn't been quite as good as like some of the stuff prior, but I believe it will bounce back. And I've always actually enjoyed watching Sheik. Plup was always one of my favorite to watch as well. So I think it's cool to see Jmook as well.
Well, thank you so much for letting me talk so much about Melee. Now let's move on a little bit to what you do now, which is speedrunning. I saw that you're streaming earlier today, if I'm remembering correctly. So as someone who isn't that big into video games other than Melee, can you like help me to understand what was the pool going from Melee to speedrunning? Was it an instant thing? Did you know you were gonna do that, or did you feel like maybe after a year or so you said, "Oh, I'll give it a whirl," because you're pretty damn good at it.
Thank you, thank you. So when it comes to Mario 64, the very first time I got introduced to it as a speedrunning game was in 2008, 2009. A friend of mine, the same friend that was actually along on that Genesis 4 road trip we had, he was doing some 16 star back then. And he showed me, some, at the time, it was probably more advanced, but like very basic now. But I thought it was like very cool how you can move around in the game. And one of my bigger appeals of Melee is how nicely you can move in the game. You feel almost like one with the game, if that makes sense. So I thought it was very cool, but nothing really came out of it. Then on Twitch in 2011, I found Siglemic Stream. For people that don't know who it is, you could basically say that he was like the Ken of SM64. That would probably be like the closest melee comparison. I found his stream and I was like, holy shit, this game is so sick. And I wanted to pick it up in 2011, but I played Melee, right? And as I
Mm-hmm.
said, Melee was all or nothing. And it did not take many minutes to watch that to realize that this is very time consuming if you want to be good. So I spectated the game, like a little bit here and there from 2011 to 2020, but I always felt that I want to test it out one day. But as long as I played Melee, I was like, I'm not going to do it. It takes too much time. I can see that just by looking at a little bit, right? So when I stopped playing Melee, Ultimate came out shortly after. As most people that played Melee, we tested Ultimate for a while, right? I played it a lot. I think it was fun playing offline against good players in some matchups. I will say that there are too many matchups in Ultimate I don't really enjoy, or that's not my cup of tea. But I think playing against some of them, like playing against MK Leo, his Joker, or Marv, or Lights Fox. I mean, there were fun players. Um, but yeah, the online in that game, I'm sorry, Ultimate fans, but Nintendo is treating you like trash as well.
Yeah.
It's the best-selling fighting game of all time, and that's the online we get, really.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but yeah, so I played Ultimate for a year, but then I was too fed up with the online, and I didn't really want to like get too serious with it. So yeah, then when the Ultimate phase was over, it really felt like, all right, SM64. I wanted to do this like 9 years ago. Now seems like a perfect time. I'm not really playing Melee any longer. Play like once in a while for fun. I don't want to like stream Ultimate. The online is terrible. Uh, even though the game was fun. So I was like, yeah, SM64. It's a new project. It's something that I haven't really done before. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much how it went. It was always like in the back of my mind, you could say.
What are some of the similarities and some of the differences going from, a high level melee player to a high level speedrunner? Because if I'm remembering this correctly, you can correct me if I'm wrong. In the first 2 years that you started seriously speedrunning, you went to becoming a top 20 time, which I
Yeah,
is pretty crazy, right?
yeah, I mean it was solid. I'm not trying to sell myself short, but it's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely been some players improving way faster. Suigi being the best example. I think he picked up the game around the same time I did, maybe shortly before, shortly after, and he has like world record in like three categories. Had world record in 72, so like four of the main five. So there absolutely are some players that have improved way faster and are way better. Uh, but yeah, I mean similarities with the game. Like I think a lot. Like obviously both are video games. They're both very heavy on movement, execution, tricks or glitches or whatever you want to call it. So I mean, I think they give a similar type of feel or vibe when it comes to just play the game. But differences, they are more different than most people probably think about at the same time. Some people are like, oh, like nerves, for example. I feel like my nerves was always very good in melee. I think it's very different in speedrunning. Probably more different than most people realize. For me, two of the biggest differences with nerves and speedrunning compared to melee. This is more applied to SM64 specifically, I will say. But one of them is in melee, you start a set and it's game on, right?
Hmm.
You kind of like are fully prepared at once, right? Or at least you should be. In speedrunning, it's more like slowly but surely starts getting to you, right?
Yeah, I could
Like
see that.
you play the first 5, 10, 15 minutes for like the millionth time, there is no nerves. But then all of a sudden, it's kind of like starting to get there. And I think that's very different to handle. Another one I think also is very different that I personally find way harder. Uh, some people may find it easier, but that's the downtime. In Melee, you have downtime between the games, but then it's you're there, right? I think for me, often when I played my best Melee was kind of like when I was not consciously having any thoughts. Like I could adapt and see patterns almost like it was automatic, right?
Hmm.
Like I could notice people's habits and I could punish them without consciously thinking about it. But in SM64, when it's a downtime every time you grab the star, I think it's so easy to like just get distracted by your own thoughts. And that makes it harder for me. Someone that maybe plays melee with more conscious thoughts maybe would find the breaks beneficial, but I find them harder. But maybe that's also like just the way I played melee. Uh, but yeah, that's some different factors when it comes to like nerves alone. I also think they're very different in terms of like the objective. In speedrunning, essentially what you're asking from the player is your peak at one given time. You could
Mm.
get like a world record one time, and theoretically, you don't get within 2 minutes of that time ever again. But you're still going to be above everyone on the leaderboard, right? That's
Hmm.
what you're asking from a speedrunner, traditionally speaking. There are some tournaments and events, but generally speaking, that's the skill you ask for. In Melee, you're asking, who is best today? And then stuff like consistency and stuff becomes more important. And I don't know. I just guess the way Melee tournaments worked, it was more in line with my strengths, if that makes sense. Like I think in Melee, like the mental aspect too, right? Like nerves, if we come back to that too, like I feel like I could very often feel my opponent's mental state by like their body language or how they move in the game. Sometimes when I see how their character moves, it's like I'm certain that you are afraid or I'm
Mm.
certain you're frustrated. And I know which options are more likely to happen on screen due to your mental state. But if I
Hmm.
speed run, it's not like I can be like, "Oh, the cartridge. What's your mental state?"
Yeah.
I'm out of luck on that, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess my strengths was more. I don't want to say wired, but for a lack of a better word, it was more like pushed in the melee direction. So I think that's been harder in SM64. That is like a very different skill set. But it's been fun to learn. It's been fun to learn.
Yeah, and not only do you do that, but you do it on your stream. You can plug it if you would like. Like what? Isn't that harder to do? I feel like when you're like you have to like do a stream, but you're also trying to do a world record. Like, how are you able to balance both?
Yeah, that can be. I think like part of it is like probably in maybe some people's heads. Like when I played in the melee tournament, I never felt like I was playing on stream.
Hmm.
You are, but I don't think I ever felt that I'm playing on stream. I'm just on the stage playing. But in SM64, it's not like I don't feel like I'm on stream. I know I'm on my own stream. I talk to the chat. So I think that aspect can make it a little bit weirder and harder. I would say one thing though to me that I feel like is very beneficial with streaming the attempts is that some days you have very bad days. You play very bad, you reset in the first couple minutes over and over. Then it's very nice to have chat there and you can just talk about whatever.
Mm.
I think I play better in early game when I have people to chat with, compared to if I have to focus too much on the early game. But if I make it far on good pace, then I normally close the chat and they know that I'm just gonna focus on the game now.
Do you feel like how we were talking earlier about discipline, does that translate into this game? Because I assume it takes a lot of discipline to restart every single time.
Yeah, I would say I would call that more patience in a sense, which
Mm.
I would say I had in melee. But the discipline, yeah, like I do practice a decent amount off stream. So I would say the discipline is still there. And don't get me wrong, I love SM64, but I think I will never have that crazy burning desire I had in melee to be the best.
Mm.
Like if I don't end up being like top five or whatever in SM64, I'm not gonna regret it. I'm having fun. Like I'm trying to improve. Obviously, I enjoy the process. But in melee, it was almost like an obsession or close to it. I don't really know what other word I would use to describe it, but it was like my life mission. Here, I'm more, I guess, just trying to enjoy the road and whatever happens, happens. And I think for someone like me, that burning desire or obsession is probably almost needed at times, but I also don't think it's something you can force. So, yeah, again, like I'm trying to get better, I'm trying to improve, but I see it more as like a fun project rather than like a life mission or a life goal.
Mm. Do you feel like framing it as a fun project versus, a life goal, life mission like Melee back in the day, is that healthier for you, or do you feel like both are equally viable for you?
I would say it depends on what you want out of it.
Mm.
I mean, I think they are both more healthy based on what I feel and what I want. So I think if you reverse them, so I had the same SM64 type of mindset with Melee and the Melee one for SM64, they probably would be more hurtful that way. But I think, how they are phrased for the two different games is probably more healthy for where I am as a person, if
And
that makes sense.
totally, yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I guess finally, then, what are some of your future aspirations with speedrunning? Is this something that you want to continue to do for a while? Do you feel like this is something that you want to maybe jump to a different type of video game or a different type of speed run or something different entirely in the future? Do you even know? Do you even care? What's your future aspirations?
So for speedrunning, I think when it's all said and done with SM64, and I have no plans on stopping anytime soon if someone is scared about that. I still enjoy it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But I think down the line, I would like to have a good time in 120 star, which I haven't even started with. I would like to have a good time in 70, and I don't consider my time good yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to have a good time in 70. And it will be okay to have like a decent time in 16. I don't really care too much for the category, but I think having like a respectable time in 16 and a good one in the two longer categories is something I want to do. With 120, my issue currently is that it's such a long project to learn,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like I can't really take that time right now. Partially, I want to get a better time in 71st, like at least a 10-second improvement. Ideally, more like 20, but at least 10 seconds before I would even consider doing 120. Um, but then it's also, yeah, the time. I estimate I probably would need pretty serious practice for at least 3 months. And truth to be told, practice is not really what people enjoy watching. And I don't blame them, right?
Yeah.
So either I have to do it on stream, and then that becomes a bit of a hassle from a stream perspective, or I do it off stream, and then we're looking at a very long project because obviously it will take longer if I do it off stream only because I won't have as much time. So it is a project that will be worked on eventually 120, but for now it's kind of like having the back seat. But hopefully, at some point in 2025, the first 120 star run will happen.
Awesome. Well, in the interest of time, I'll wrap up with a couple more questions about outside of the sticks. So when you're not playing video games or streaming, what do you do to relax? What do you do to have fun? What's something that you can, take your mind off and just chill? What does Armada do?
I mean, besides video games, like that's always been like my biggest passion. Like I do like sports. Maybe I
Hmm.
don't do it to relax, but I would say next to video games, it's my second favorite hobby. So I go to a solid chunk of the football games. Briefly mentioned that earlier. Season pass for my football team. We won today.
Let's go.
Unexpected, but they did
Who's
good.
your club?
Hmm?
Who's your club? Who do you
It's
support?
a local team here in Gothenburg. We have been bad for 15 years, but like we, it's my team, right? You got
Yeah.
to stay loyal to your team.
Hmm.
So any non-Swede would not know who they are, but it's our team. Uh, and then also hockey. I go to a decent amount of hockey games. Our hockey team here in Gothenburg is actually pretty good. So hopefully we have a good season coming up. The season starts actually on Saturday, so very, very soon. Probably the first game may have been played by the time this is up. I don't know. But yeah, so those are pretty big things for sure. Yeah, like video games and sports are my two main things. But I mean, hanging out with friends a lot, playing board game is pretty common that we do if we hang out. Um, so yeah,
Yeah. What position if you had to play in soccer, what position are you playing?
if I had to play football, I think in most team sports with a goalkeeper, it's either striker or goalkeeper.
Why?
I think for striker, I think my team's awareness. So when I played in school, it was like I wanted to play one of the two. If I'm a striker, I was not the most technical by any means, right? But similar to how you look at teams, knowing what's going to happen before it does, be at the right place at the right time. So if I played football as a striker, I will be the one doing the easy goals. I'll be there to tap it in. And it wouldn't look impressive, but it would be like I just knew where to be, right?
Hmm.
Or a goalkeeper, because then reaction time matters.
I see.
And yeah, that's the mainly part coming in. Yeah, I remember in school we had like between fourth to sixth grade, we always had these street hockey tournaments. And the 2 years I was the goalkeeper in fifth and sixth grade, we won. Easy, easy. The reactions were too strong. I practiced reaction tech chases as a goalkeeper.
I could see you being a monster under the sticks. I could see that. I could see that. Well, we ran out of time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on. I could ask you a million more questions, but unfortunately, there's only so many hours in the day. So again, thank you so much. This has been Items On. I'm your host, Ethiopian. Our guest today was Armada. Thank you so much for listening.